Primitive accumulation in the post-socialist transition and new accession period. The idea of the panel, its place within the general context of this middle school, I think it's obvious enough. Primitive accumulation, in a sense, designates a social process of creation of initial conditions of possibility for capitalism. It is transforming social and economical relations in a way that logic of capital can start to assert itself. And it's more or less conceptually necessary that something like that must have been occurring in the post-socialist countries of Eastern Europe. And we could say that the liberal ideological narrative presented this process simply as a removal of bureaucratic chains and unleashing of creative energies of entrepreneurial spirit. And against this, it is necessary, from a Marxist perspective, to examine and perhaps compare the institutional changes, political action, the organizational changes that have eventually led to the creation of something like a proper capitalist class. So, without further ado, allow me to present our speakers. Professor Joachim Becker is Professor of Economics at the University of Vienna. He's, in recent years, has been recurring guest of Workers' and Banks University. Then Goran Music is economist from Belgrade and is currently a researcher at European University in Florence, University Institute in Florence. And Branko Bembic is a close collaborator of Workers' and Banks University. He studied both philosophy and economics at the University of Ljubljana and is currently a junior researcher at the Department of Sociology. So we'll start with Professor Becker's paper, which will, I guess, offer a more broader perspective, and then continue with two more focused case studies of colleagues Music and Bembic. So please, Professor Becker, the floor is yours.
Dobar dan. I'm very happy to be here, and obviously the panel is to focus a bit on the question of primitive or ursprüngliche Akkumulation, original accumulation, and the formation of a capitalist class in Eastern Europe. And I would start very briefly with a few theoretical questions, and I mean, it is not only a question of ursprüngliche Akkumulation, but later on the question of intercapitalist competition between domestic and external capital plays a role as well, and the question of commodification and decommodification we touched upon already yesterday. In my presentation, I will focus particularly on two sub-regions of Eastern Europe, that is former Czechoslovakia and former Yugoslavia. Because in both cases, the process of original accumulation and the process of partitioning the existing state went hand in hand. And that, I think, is a very important question as well, and focusing on the question of dissolution of an existing state from the point of view of material interests which were in play. And actually that would be the first phase I would like to focus upon. Second phase would be the phase of the EU accession. I would say that is already less a phase of ursprüngliche Akkumulation, but rather a question of the intercapitalist competition. And the third phase, at least in the case of Slovenia, is the case of the present crisis and processes of recommodification during the crisis. I mean, what the Janša government and now government of Bratušek is focusing upon. And I mean, Janša declared very openly that Slovakia of Zurinda, years of 2002 to 2006, I mean, that is his model. And so far, I will particularly focus on the model of Janša, what Janša used to be a nice model. And I would say that for the process of the early 1990s, the notion of ursprüngliche Akkumulation in the sense of an original accumulation is a pertinent one. Because from my point of view, in the state socialist countries, capitalism did not exist. There was no accumulation of capital. And insofar, there was no private appropriation of surplus. Though it was distinct groups, I would even call them classes, who were able to dispose collectively over the surplus that used to be the top layer of the state and the party, and to a lesser extent the management of the state-owned, or in the case of Yugoslavia, socially owned companies. And in the case of Yugoslavia, the role of the management of these socially owned companies used to be more important than the case of the other East European countries, and so far there was a difference. The direct producers formerly had a share in the public property, but in the case of most East European countries, I mean, it had the form of state property, and so far their role was fairly reduced. Nevertheless, it was almost impossible to fire workers. There was full employment in most East European countries, and on the shop floor, workers had a certain say. Limited one, but a certain say. In Yugoslavia, I would say that the role of workers, because of the self-management type of socialism, was more important than in the case of the other East European countries. And if you have a look at this social structure, we can see that in the crisis of the 1980s and the reduction of the dynamics of economic growth in the socialist countries, and particularly the crisis in the case of Yugoslavia, the deep crisis in the case of Yugoslavia, it was rather the top of society which had a vanguard role in transformation. It was very few countries, mainly Poland, but there was really organized popular opposition to state socialism. Slovenia, I would say, it's a very peculiar situation as well, but I don't want to go into that deeply. And with the end of the Soviet Union, I mean, the changes in Eastern Europe massively accelerated. And the process of original accumulation started. And the main discussion was who would control the process of privatization or original accumulation. And in the case of rather decentralized countries with strong regional structures, in the case of Yugoslavia, the republics, in the case of Czechoslovakia, the Czech and the Slovak part of the country, and in a parallel way in the Soviet Union. The question was as well whether it would be the central government or the Republican governments. And in the case of Yugoslavia, I mean, the crisis already had led to an advanced degree of something like Republican nationalism, and the attempt of each republic to reduce the effects of the crisis, switching the course to the other republics. And I would say that the motive of controlling the process of original accumulation was one of the central motives of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. And I mean, with the partition of Yugoslavia, it was, I mean, the Republican leaderships which were able, in a way, to control the process of original accumulation and to use their political power in order to facilitate the private accumulation of persons, usually close to the establishment. And in the case of Serbia and Croatia, that happened under particularly opaque conditions of war. And it was, especially in the case of Serbia, I mean, with sanctions and war, I mean, it was the most opaque way. And getting the monopoly of certain imports that were essential in the period of sanctions, I mean, that was a very important base for later emergence of tycoony in Serbia. And I would say in a parallel process in Croatia. So far, these two countries, from my point of view, are not very different. Slovenia, I would say this process of primitive accumulation was concentrated at the Republican level as well. But there was I mean, it was not under war conditions, and there was a certain controversy how to do it. There was one section who was supported by IMF officials and Sachs, who presented an option which would have favored transnational capital. The alternative option was to favor the internal, something like an internal privatization, particularly in favor of the existing management. And though a compromise was struck, the compromise was closer to the second option. And insofar, something like a domestic bourgeoisie with roots in the industrial sector emerged. In the case of Czechoslovakia, the degree of uneven development was not as advanced as in the case of Yugoslavia. The question of the borders was not contentious, but the question how to privatize and how this transformation process should be organized, I mean, there were controversies on that between the Czech and the Slovak part. And the question of how to privatize was one of the dividing issues of the Czech and Slovak establishment. Of Občanská demokratická strana, of Václav Klaus on the one hand, and Hnutie za demokratické Slovensko of Mečiar on the other hand. And I mean, as you know, Klaus was in favor of voucher privatization. And proclaimed that something like a form of popular capitalism. But it was not popular capitalism that emerged. In the end, it was investment funds that emerged from this privatization, and these investment funds were able to concentrate property. And in order to build up their economic base, they were able to draw to a certain extent on the still state-owned banks. Česká sporitelna, Komerčná banka, and IPB. The latter was very close to the Klaus establishment. And the public-owned banks helped to build up something like a domestic bourgeoisie, which was I would call it a holding type of bourgeoisie. It's a diversified portfolio. And in Slovakia, different type of privatization, voucher privatization finished in Slovakia with the Slovakian independence, and they went for direct sales to the friends of Mečiar. And in that way, local bourgeoisie was built up as well. And again, the banks, state-owned banks were important, providing credits to that group. And what can be seen in both cases, that it was a type of financial groups that were emerging, especially since the second half of the 1990s. It was less industrial, less an industrial logic, rather it was a something like a financial logic. And actually, I would argue that the early 1990s in most countries were characterized by the attempt to build something like a domestic bourgeoisie. Exception is Hungary, highly dependent on the IMF, and Poland was in between, I would say. And with the recession of the early 1990s, external capital was not too much interested in the region in the beginning. They only were interested in certain important factories, but not generally. But that changed with the end of the recession. And that is the late 1990s. And that is the second phase. Second phase is of EU accession, at least for Slovenia, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And here the Slovak case is particularly interesting because Slovakia was excluded from the first round of candidate countries. It was said because of democracy, but it was clear it had more to do with the insufficient degree of selling of property to West European capital. And I would call that the Euro or EU-oriented neoliberal forces made their election campaign on that issue. And they got a lot of conceptual support from US-financed think tanks. And in 1998, coalition government of social liberals and these EU-oriented neoliberal forces was formed. And one of the first things they did was to privatize the banking sector. I mean, the banks were loaded with a lot of bad debts because of support for this local bourgeoisie. And it was, in that case, was mainly Austrian and partially Italian banks who bought the banks. But before the banks could be sold, something like a bad bank, or bad bank, two bad banks were formed, to which the bad loans were shifted. Konsolidačná banka, as it was called. And so far, the banks were much more attractive for foreign buyers because, I mean, they were free from bad credits. And it was the state who assumed the losses. And the losses were significant. And secondly, apart from banking and more generally the financial sector, basic infrastructure was sold as well. Big infrastructure went to foreign capital, but the small infrastructure went to local companies, financial holding companies, very well connected to the then government. It was mainly two groups, Penta Group and GNT, which, I mean, they won almost all the tenders. And I mean, for example, for the airport of Bratislava, it was Penta which bid it jointly with the airport of Vienna. But later, because the government changed, privatization did not happen. For the health sector, I mean, Penta did it on their own, because for that they had the sufficient capital. And in the Czech Republic, the process was very similar. And there, because of fomenting ODS, business close to ODS, banks had a lot of bad debts as well. Again, bad bank was formed, banks were sold, in that case mainly again to Austrian banks and partially to Belgian banks. And it was, in that case, it was a social democracy that sold the banks. But the privatization of social infrastructure, material infrastructure happened as well in the Czech Republic. The difference is that the Czech Republic, the government was more hesitant to privatize social security. in Slovakia, that was done in a very radical way according to the Chilean model. And the brother of the present Chilean President Piñera was one of the main architects during the Pinochet regime of privatizing the pension system. And he was a couple of times in Slovakia advertising how beautiful privatization of pension system is. And in Slovenia, there is a difference. The Slovenian government was in a way more cautious in its external relations. There was, for example, contrary to the Czech Republic and Slovakia, there was not a significant current account deficit. The necessity for foreign credits, therefore, was rather limited because of the exchange rate policies. And the Slovenian governments, I mean, they favored particularly at that time in the 1990s, they favored particularly the manufacturing sector, and they preserved domestic property and partially state property in banking and in industry. So far, the composition of the domestic bourgeoisie in Czech Republic, Slovakia on the one hand, and Slovenia is different, because in Slovenia there is a much more prominent role of private domestic capital in industry, and I would say it is more of a internal bourgeoisie in the terms of Ulanzas, whereas in Czech Republic and Slovakia it's rather comprador type of bourgeoisie. And in Croatia, even without the EU accession, the banking sector was privatized as well. That bank was created as well. And so far, it cannot only be attributed to accession. So the pressures have been very strong. And in the case of Croatia today, I mean, for example, there was a very strong pressure to privatize the shipyards. And privatizing will mean closing them down. So far, competition for West European capital will disappear. And with that, the last technologically relatively advanced industrial sector in Croatia. And now, present-day Slovenia, third phase. And I would not call it original accumulation, but now it is something like partially an element of intercapitalist competition and of commodification. The crisis has inter alia its roots in the first Janša government, and I mean the rapid expansion of domestic credit for the construction and real estate sector, and that was partially externally financed. And with that, a certain fragility of the banking sector does exist. In many regards, I would say the situation in Slovenia is less dramatic than it is presented, even by the present government. And Janša, and again, now the new Prime Minister Bratušek, are invoking the threat of a necessity of calling for the so-called support of the European Union and the IMF, and saying better we do what the IMF and the EU Commission demand on our own. And arguing and preparing the same types of policies as they used to be in Slovakia in the early 2000s. Creating, holding for public enterprises in order to privatize them, firstly. That is like Slovakia or Czech Republic. Secondly, creation of bad banks. And that, I mean, will load the budget with a lot of bad credits. And it's from my point of view, it's a preparation of privatizing the banks. And the government already announced that they want to privatize at least one of the banks. I think it's not a good idea. Second element is commodification, making the second pillar of the pension system private pillar obligatory. I mean, it cannot be argued that this will help the budget. I mean, it shifts further costs to the budget because people pay into that second pillar, but the public part of the pension system has for decades to pay the pensions. And so far it is a load, extra load on the budget. And I mean, even liberal conservative or even massively conservative governments like Hungary totally abolished second pillar. Poland, Slovakia reduced the amount of money going to the second pillar for fiscal reasons. But, I mean, it helps financialization and it helps the private insurance sector, this type of policy. And that, of course, is a type of commodification. And I mean, already with the Janša government, it was obvious that certain sectors of services are slowly privatized. And there, small domestic capital can enter. And a certain type of comprador type of bourgeoisie is being created. And so far, the question is in how far Slovenia would be different from the rest of the region, even with that limited difference, if that type of policy continues. Because at the moment, I would say the Slovenian domestic bourgeoisie is partially different from Croatia, Serbia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. In all cases, it is rather commerce, real estate, certain service sectors where the bourgeoisie is established and very often associated with international capital. In Slovenia, it has a stronger industrial element. And so far, I would say partially it is different, and for that, the role of the state and public banks is important as well. Voilà.
So what I will do is I will try to shortly describe the process of restoration of capitalism in Serbia, its main actors and consequences. And after that I will shortly pose a question. I will take a step back and try to pose a question of how appropriate the concept of the original accumulation of capital is when one analyzes this transformation. And then we could maybe dwell more on this broader question in the discussion part. So the idea is to build up upon the skeleton that the sketch that Joachim Becker just presented now, focus really on Serbia for the moment, bring out the texture of this case study, and then deduct certain more general questions about the nature of the new ruling classes in Eastern Europe, and trying to make us be more attentive or not rush into labeling things automatically as accumulation, original accumulation of capital, if we notice elements within it such as dispossession or commodification and so on. But as I said, we could discuss more in discussion period, and I would like to present the Serbian case study in the following 15 minutes. So, as it is well known, the Yugoslav socialism was unique in utilizing market impulses for a larger extent than any other regime of so-called real existing socialism, until we could say maybe even the transformation of China in the early 1990s. And one can argue that the Yugoslav elites in all the republics were in a way better prepared for the transitional path than other regimes in Eastern Europe in the late 80s. So, reading these signs of the time, a fraction of the Serbian communist nomenclatura and enterprise managers, which had a really strong and important position in Yugoslav system, as Joachim pointed out, attempted to prevent the loss of their privileges by introducing very radical political and economic reforms into the Yugoslav socialist system of 1980s. And in the second half of that decade, the reformist wing of the Serbian party, which was gathered around a politician named Slobodan Milošević, planned the original idea at that time. The discussions within the elite was to keep certainly the social property as a kind of a main sector of the Yugoslav economy, to keep it intact, but to boost its efficiency by exposing it to private investments and foreign capital and foreign direct investments. Nevertheless, by the time the Soviet Union disintegrated and the spread of capitalism in Eastern Europe appeared unstoppable, all ideas about preservation of some kind of, quote, market socialism of Yugoslav kind were put aside. So the Serbian nomenclatura tried to emulate the main trends taking place in Eastern Europe and globally. It was not anymore at the vanguard of the processes in Eastern Europe. It felt lagging behind by the opening of the 1990s. But still, it attempted to emulate and go down this path on its own terms. So the first Serbian privatization law remained dedicated to a kind of an organic development of full-scale capitalist economy out of the old structures of socialist self-management. The link between the two was the concept of workers' shareholding. In late socialism, under the pressure of pro-market liberal interpretations of workers' self-management, the social property, the property which was seen as belonging to the society as a whole, was slowly but surely transformed into group ownership. It was understood as the ownership of the workers who work in a particular enterprise. And then, with the transformation of socially owned work organizations into stock companies in the late 80s and early 90s, the collective ownership gave way to kind of a conventional individual private ownership. Right? So most Eastern European governments went about privatizing their state property either through direct sales to one majority owner or the so-called voucher privatizations. And these voucher privatizations meant that the state enterprises were transformed into shareholding companies, and then the shares were distributed to the general population, and they were enabled to participate in this process by trading their small piece of stock in the stock market. And the method of privatization inside Serbia was distinctive in the sense that the majority of the company shares were first offered for sale to present and past employees under preferential terms. So many workers used this opportunity to become shareholders of their factories. And of course, those who benefited the most from this method of so-called insider buyouts were not ordinary workers of these enterprises, but company management and other investors who were in a position during socialist times to amass large sums of money through the misuse of social capital. The idea, therefore, was to create a new entrepreneurial class out of the sections of the old party bureaucracy and market-savvy managers of social enterprises, the so-called technocracy. This attempt of Milošević faction to slide into a kind of a full-fledged market economy while simultaneously maintaining control over the main levers of national economy was put under pressure from many sides very early on. So first of all, the regime found itself stuck into a series of regional wars with rival nomenclaturas in neighboring Yugoslav republics. Internationally, the country became isolated through economic sanctions and eventually NATO direct military intervention. And faced with these pressures, the regime was forced to slow down the privatization efforts and give concessions to mafia rings, which organized parallel economic structures under war and warlike circumstances. So, an adjustment element to the economic role of the state in those years was the informal sector. And the majority of the workers in social and state-owned companies received additional income during the 90s from these side jobs on the black market. So whether they were trading in gas, cigarettes, or other scarce items smuggled under the wall of sanctions, running a small unregistered business, or simply selling behind the improvised street stall, workers made ends meet by reinventing themselves as small entrepreneurs or street hustlers. Many working class families, which kept ties to the land, returned to farming and self-subsistence. The state turned a blind eye to this type of grassroots street entrepreneurialism. On the social bottom, such practices served as a mechanism for survival and a specific valve for social dissatisfaction accumulating in society. At the top, however, this existence of a parallel economic structure which feeds off the state and social sector opened doors for those close to the regime to accumulate immense wealth through various illegal schemes. It is therefore important to note that the Milosevic regime did not stretch the transition toward capitalism because it somehow remained faithful to the maintenance of socialism. The already flexible borders of market socialism, of the Yugoslav brand of market socialism, had been firmly crossed by 1991 with the intention of transforming the society in full accordance with the criteria of functioning market economy and institutions of a bourgeois nation-state. The return of the economic role of the state was a very pragmatic reaction to the chaos that ensued with the return of capitalism and international isolation. This preservation of social ownership and new nationalizations were not undertaken with the aim of going back to the old system or expanding the authority of the working class. On the contrary, the survival of the non-private sector, tightly controlled by an authoritarian political elite and crisscrossed by burgeoning mafia networks, provided a unique framework for a process of plundering of the social value created over decades by self-managed work collectives. The decade witnessed the setting up of phantom companies and bank accounts in Cyprus and other tax havens where the money of local social enterprise directors and mafia businessmen was accumulating. Milosevic's bloc transition helped build up a new capitalist class made up of former communist apparatchiks, directors of socially owned companies, and war profiteers. On the other end of society, this slow-motion transformation broke the industrial proletariat into pieces. Out of a labor force of 3.2 million, some 700,000 people were left without a job by the end of the decade. Even if one formally kept his or her job, many became declassed during the 10-year-long struggle for survival. Most companies continued to produce at a minimal level of output, with shorter work times or forced leaves. For many, the retirement age came as they sat idle in the empty factory halls expecting better days. People who were previously skilled workers became lumpenized through the informal sector. Others hoped to advance their social position by opening small private businesses. Many returned to the farming and livestock as their main source of income. The Serbian working class thus managed to escape the direct blow of shock therapy, which spread throughout Eastern Europe in those years, but only to face the alternative of a slow death by 1,000 cuts. The Milosevic regime fell in October 2000, and with it also the international isolation. The initial promise of neoliberal strategists was that the entry of foreign capital and faster privatization would restructure and remodernize the industrial sector. In their vision, attracted by Serbia's comparative advantages, multinational companies would finally undertake the necessary changes in the state, changes that the state was allegedly not able to do. They would buy up the manufacturing businesses, make them competitive through a cycle of fresh investment, and start exporting to the world market. On the other hand, unlike the politically appointed managers of the Milosevic era, the new local private owners would put an end to the plunder of wealth accumulated during socialism and put the machines to a good use. By making common sense analogies with everyday life experiences, many workers tended to agree with this logic. Just as a worker would take care of his or her own house, the new owner would supposedly have interest in maintaining the well-being of his factory. However, this turned out to be a completely wrong assumption. Left to their own devices, multinational companies, local tycoons, and a whole array of smaller businessmen created a dystopian society which had much more in common with the previous decade of wars and sanctions than the bright capitalist modernity once envisioned by the anti-Milosevic oppositional activists. Foreign corporations brought up the monopolies and saved profit makers, such as banks, petrol industry, breweries, and tobacco manufacturers. The large Serbian capitalists, on their part, positioned themselves as the middlemen between the Western exporters and the local consumers. Taking advantage of the neoliberal insistence on strong local currency and credit expansion, they focused on buying import companies and retail chains. The foreign-owned banks also played it safe. They used the opportunity to charge high interest rates for consumer credit and speculated in the real estate market with little interest for long-term developmental investment. This left the majority of the industrial enterprises in the hands of smaller owners with fortunes tracing their origin back to the mafia capitalism of the 1990s. These investors had no intention of reviving manufacturing. Instead, they counted on continuing the scavenging of the leftovers of the social sector. So around 25% of all privatizations in Serbia have been annulled because the new owners did not fulfill their end of obligations stemming from the privatization contracts. And in the industrial sector, this percentage goes up. It's around 1/3, which is officially recognized by the state and annulled legally. So the plan of the investors was usually to suck the undervalued capital out of the companies through dubious schemes. In cases when the company was built on, for example, attractive real estate location, they aimed to dismantle the plant, get rid of the workers, and sell the factory ground as a real estate. As a result, even the minimum of productive activity, which was maintained in the 1990s, came to a halt. It was not unusual for a factory to be privatized 2 or 3 times in a row just in order to find somebody willing to organize something resembling a normal work process. The short economic boom in the banking sector, telecommunications, and trade took place primarily in big, large urban centers such as Belgrade and Novi Sad. And this display window progress enabled the politicians and the media to ignore the deindustrialization of the provincial cities. So after 20 years of transition, Serbia is still not able to reach 1/2 of the value that it produced in 1990 of manufacturing. Before the transition, the manufacturing made up at least 30% of the total GDP. And 2 decades later, this share has gone down to around meager 15%. The unemployment rate oscillated around 20% throughout the last decade, only to pass the 25% mark in the latest crisis. And in 1990, the industrial plant capacity utilization stood at 69% in the last year of self-managed economy. And for the economists of that era, this was the ultimate proof of the inefficiency of the crisis-ridden socialist economy. However, under the laissez-faire ethos of transitional Serbia, the plant capacity utilization index dropped down to a staggering 43.4%. The economy remains dependent on the remittances of Serbian citizens working in Western Europe, the EU association funds, foreign credits, and the privatization of state companies with few internal sources of the creation of value. So now I would like to take a step back and get an overview of what have I described so far. What does this process amount to? Number one, we clearly see that there was a process of dispossession, of separation of workers from the means of production by downgrading worker self-management to, first of all, workers' shareholding or nationalization of social property, and then in the second step, full-fledged privatization to one majority owner, mostly foreign. The second thing which we see happening is pauperization, the extreme redistribution of wealth within the society between the haves and the have-nots. This is also clear from what I described so far. And number three, it is deindustrialization, of course. A profound deindustrialization and a prolonged crisis with no light at the end of the tunnel after 20 years of transition. So the question is, how do these phenomena measure up to the process of primitive accumulation as described by Marx? So in the strict sense, viewing it historically, according to Marx, the primitive accumulation of capital is a process taking place in early capitalism, through which the layer of the middle bourgeoisie, meaning that the owners of the manufacturers, are formed, and following the demise of small peasantry and gilded craftsmen. It was the necessary precondition for the concentration of capital and industrialization, which gave rise to the layer of big industrial capitalists, in the words of Marx, the so-called leaders of the whole industrial armies. The historical process that I just described taking place in Serbia is in a way quite the opposite one. The former Serbian socialist elite, which attempted to transform itself into a national bourgeoisie, was defeated militarily. And even if there was no war, it became dissolved inside the crony capitalism of the 1990s. So today, the local business elites, the so-called tycooni, are heavily indebted to foreign banks and focus on retail and land speculation, as I described. The kind of smaller level shady businessmen do continue to enter the industrial companies and factories, but they do so in order to scavenge the remains of the once successful enterprises. The foreign capital, on the other hand, is not strong enough or without enough interest to revive economic activity inside Serbia by hefty investment, as it did in the case, to an extent, in the case of transitional countries standing closer to the borders of Western Europe in the late 1990s, such as the Visegrad 4 countries. So, and of course, I already described the role of the foreign banking sector, which is very, very conservative and actually choking the further development of the economy and the extension of credit for the infrastructural projects. So, therefore, in a sense, we were definitely witnessing dispossession, commodification, but we were not witnessing accumulation, but the destruction of capital on a mass scale, which seems to go without end. What is the exact nature, therefore, of the ruling class of Serbia and Eastern Europe? There is still some work in front of us if we want to answer this question in detail. In the case of Serbia, it is clear that the last 20 years did not give birth to a confident bourgeoisie which has a sense of historical purpose, capable of developing domestic means of production. What we are witnessing is a type of, as you said, a comprador ruling class, desperately divided, evolved in constant infightings with no common purpose or productive activity, and completely dependent on foreign credits and donations. And this, of course, is not a purely academic question. It goes to the heart of the political perspectives and orientation of small but growing left forces in the region, right? So the question that we must pose to ourselves is there space for development of productive forces in the region along the capitalist lines? This is the bottom question. And if yes, how big is it? What is the space? If not, what are our alternatives that we offer? Is this a phenomenon restricted to the former Soviet republics or the Balkans, or even to only the eastern part of former Yugoslavia? Or is this something which is common to all transitional states? Yeah? This is also something which we should look into in more detail. How different are the economies of Central Europe? And is there a section of the ruling class that we could critically support in a term of a national bourgeoisie versus the comprador bourgeoisie, or something along those terms? If not, then what is our program for ruling the economy and organizing the social and economic life of our countries without these ruling elements? Thank you.
Thank you, Goran. And now we move to the final speaker, Branko.
Okay. There we focus on the relationships between three actors in Slovenian transition, namely the emerging national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie on one hand, and working class and organized labor on the other hand. Now, as transition to capitalism commenced in Slovenia at the beginning of the 90s, one of the main questions was, of course, the problem of turning property that was until then in social ownership into private property functioning as capital. This problem has to be understood in terms of what Marx called the primary accumulation. As with the abolition of social ownership, the society and collectives of workers were expropriated and private owners emerged. As regards these private owners, there were two main alternatives. Either selling the property to the highest bidder, which, at least in the case of larger enterprises, meant selling it to the foreign capital, or alternatively, some domestic owner could be found. This in turn means that two paths to the capitalist ownership relations were possible, either by the dominance of foreign capital or by establishing a national bourgeoisie that was at that time virtually non-existent. In Slovenia, the second option was attempted. One of the ways to achieve that was the traditional method of primitive accumulation, that is, theft, which predominated in the so-called phase of wild privatization. In this phase, management of various companies used the old Yugoslavian legislation in order to appropriate the companies by establishing bypass companies, by free transfers of capital, and so on. It is estimated that during this phase, the assets of whose worth adjusted for inflation exceeded 1 billion of today's euros went into the private hands by illicit means. Now, this phase of wild privatization was followed by a first wave of regular privatization that began with the passing of the law on transformation of social ownership in 1992, and which provided for several methods of transformation from social to private ownership, but left the decision on the appropriate method to the companies themselves. Besides standard privatization techniques, the law stipulated a distributive privatization by vouchers to all citizens, while a considerable part of the property went to the parastatal funds. The law also allowed an allocation of shares to managers, workers and their families in exchange for vouchers, as well as internal buyouts with considerable discounts. Given the opportunity for an internal buyout and division of shares to insiders, workers and managers obtained majority in most of the profitable small and medium-sized enterprises, while the large and profitable companies combined internal distribution of shares with public auctions. Also, a large part of property ended in the hands of state. Now, the law of transformation of ownership and the outcome of the first wave of privatization reflected the political exchanges which the political elite and the emerging national bourgeoisie had to make with the workers. For by late 80s and continuing into the 90s, as the country went in the deep economic crisis, a massive strike wave took place that culminated in 1992 when the government tried to unilaterally freeze wages. The law on privatization can therefore be seen as a measure for pacifying the working class. But as it was by no means the only, this was by no means the only concession. Other political and economic exchanges that aimed at securing the compromise between the workers and the emerging bourgeoisie and its political allies included social transfers in form of early retirements and unemployment benefits, as well as a large increase in wages, which, contrary to the government fears, actually helped to pull the economy out of the recession. Further, the central bank cemented the compromise by implementing the policy of controlled depreciation of the currency vis-à-vis main trading partners, which at least partially offset the growth of prices and wages in the non-tradable sector that were spilling to the tradable, to the export sector, and threatening its price competitiveness. This policy, in turn, eased the pressure for wage suppression and intensification of work in the exporting sector. As Bela Kreskovic remarked in his comparative analysis of the work on the role of central banks in Estonia, Hungary, and Slovenia, during the transition period, even the Slovenian central bank actually acted as a social partner. Another achievement of labor mobilization was the establishment of the Economic and Social Council in 1994, by which organized labor became institutionally recognized as the legitimate social partner, and it institutionalized the tripartite dialogue, covering a wide array of issues from social policy to labor law, the central policy being, of course, the income policy. From that time on, the organized labor, acting in its capacity as social partner, was able to achieve quite a few gains on behalf of the working class. However, some of the concessions to the working class, in particular the spoils of the privatization process, turned sour as the shares held by the workers were quickly changing hand in the second half of the 90s. Workers were selling the shares in order to improve household budgets in hard times, or simply get additional cash for the purchase of some durable good. These once and for all spurts of household consumption were at the end quite a low closing price for the workers' rights enjoyed under the self-management system. The ownership structure established after the first wave of privatization, in which workers retained a relatively important share role, was never meant to last anyway. Now, the phase of consolidation of ownership was called the second wave of privatization. While the ownership share of insiders fell in the second half of the 90s, the share of workers decreased dramatically, while the share of the management actually expanded. In the period between 1999 and 2004, average share of the largest owner increased by more than 1/3, while the average number of stockholders decreased by roughly 1/3. This second wave of privatization reached its peak in the period from 2004 to 2008, that was marked by notorious management buyouts, in which the shares of the acquired companies were pledged as loans, as collateral for loans. These loans were in turn made attractive by historically low interest rates that prevailed after Slovenia and landed in the ERM2 and later joined the Eurozone in 2007. The acquired companies were nonetheless placed under considerable financial strain as their new owners diverted profits away from investments in order to repair their debts. But in the big picture, it looked like it was for everybody's benefit, as on the one hand, the advocates of domestic accumulation got the strengthening of the position of the national bourgeoisie, while at the other hand, the neoliberals got the withdrawal of the state from the economy, as the sellers of the shares were mainly the parastatal funds. The results of labor mobilization heavily influenced the nature of Slovenian transition. Most of other Central and Eastern European countries that joined the EU in 2004 sooner or later turned to the development path under hegemony of transnational capital, which was reinforced by the EU accession process. Especially the Visegrad countries were able to attract significant amounts of FDI, which, however, proved to be a double-edged sword. The demands of foreign investors for a favorable tax treatment, generous investment incentives, and loosening labor regulations sparked a race to the bottom, which, on the one hand, exposed the working class to the vagaries of the capitalist market, and on the other hand, eroded the welfare state's capacity to alleviate the social burden of such measures. The outcome of the working class struggle, however, precluded a development path under the auspices of foreign capital in Slovenia. First, the privatization process implicitly favored insiders and other domestic owners over foreign investors. Secondly, organized labor strength was reflected in relatively high wages and labor costs that made the country less attractive for foreign investors. Finally, central bank policy aimed at preventing the appreciation of the currency contributed to a limited penetration of FDI. The Slovene neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie decided when the foreign advisors advocating shock therapy at the very beginning of transition was more or less marginalized throughout the first decade. But by the end of the 90s, when capitalist market economy was once firmly established, capitalist business was becoming more and more independent. Around the turn of the century, a new generation of liberal economists emerged. They shunned what they perceived as cozy relationships in the economy and politics and argued that Slovenia ought to take bold steps toward the liberal economic model. They launched an ideological attack on the workers that demanded the state protection and social policies, perceiving this as the Odsonian powerful interest groups and accusing them of increasing their relative share of income by battles for distribution, instead of engaging in productive activities and thus hampering the competitiveness of the national economy. Further, the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie argued that the higher penetration of FDI would improve competitiveness of the national economy, as it would not only bring fresh capital, more efficient organization, new technologies, and integration of Slovene companies into the global networks, but it would also sweep away the corruptive relations in the state-owned companies, increase the role of the private sector, restructure the companies, and, last but not least, of course, increase competition. The advocates of the national interest, that is, the ideology of the national bourgeoisie, on the other hand, argued in favor of domestic owners and domestic accumulation in order to preserve social and environmental standards of the country, but also to strengthen the material foundations of Slovene identity, nurture the Slovenian elite, as they put it, and this goes especially for the banks, helping the domestic economy in conquering the markets of ex-Yugoslavia, which were seen as a kind of Lebensraum for Slovenian firms. Now, it goes without saying that the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie turned a deaf ear to workers' fear of decline in labor standards brought by the competition for foreign capital. Nor did it bother about the shedding of labor, longer hours, and flexibilization of labor arrangements after the privatization of presumably inefficient state enterprises. And while it must be admitted that the ideology of national interest indeed included the preservation of social achievements, it nonetheless questioned only the rule of foreign capital, but not the rule of capital as such. However, both ideologies share a common persuasion that it is of crucial importance to join the core of European countries and become winners in the global race for competitiveness, which is precisely the point of view of the competition state imposed by the neoliberal global order. Now, the neoliberal comprador elite was well aware that it would be next to impossible to impose its vision of neoliberal capitalism in Slovenia by a direct confrontation with other social forces. This was made painfully clear when, after almost a decade and a half, the central-right government came to power in 2004 and tried to enforce a neoliberal reform program. It was forced to back off after tens of thousands working-class protesters occupied the squares of capital city. So the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie from the outset laid its hopes in an exogenous shock that would disrupt the balance of power in Slovenia and tilt it in favor of a liberal economic model. At first, this external push was expected from the process of accession to the EU. But while this process indeed brought some changes, they were still considered too gradual and shy. With the crisis of 2008, the EU, with a little help of financial markets, however, finally performed the role of much-vaunted exogenous factor and offered a unique window of opportunity for the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie that came to power with the right-wing government in 2012 to carry through its agenda. Namely, as Slovenia is a Eurozone member, it issues its debt that is beyond its control, while due to institutional limitations of the Eurozone, it has no lender of last resort. Although the public debt in Slovenia is relatively low, for several reasons, one of these being the growing concerns of investors about the deteriorating situation of banks' balance sheets, liquidity of public finances is a burning issue since mid-2011, as the state has experienced difficulties in renewing its debts on international financial markets. In 2012, the government accordingly enacted harsh austerity measures in order to bring down the public deficit and reassure financial markets. The areas most affected were, of course, the welfare state and the public sector. But while the austerity measures are the order of the day throughout the Eurozone, the Slovenian government, on the other hand, gave up a considerable amount of tax revenues by cutting the corporate and personal income taxes. Further, it opted for a transfer of the non-performing loans from banks to a state agency that is a bad bank, which, if done at a fair price, would not increase the bank capital anyway. But the fair price of non-performing loans for a bank could be much higher than a fair price for state agency. That is to say, either the banks would require additional funds, thus more money from the state, or the state would overpay the non-performing loans. Either way, the state would be losing money. In addition, taking debts from banks, some of them still in state ownership, and converting them to equity would certainly not help the over-indebted enterprises, but it could nevertheless speed up the process of selling these companies to the private, presumably foreign owners. Finally, the money poured in banks by a bad bank would also mean free transfer of wealth to private owners in a time when welfare state is sinking under the weight of austerity measures. Although the right-wing government fell apart in the first half of the year, so that the fate of such plans is for the moment not clear, it nevertheless shows the modus operandi of Slovenian neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie. Let me be clear on this point. The strange mix of austerity on one hand and lavish transfers to the owners of capital on the other is not simply a confused policy mix as some would have it. It is a path towards the exhaustion of the state, a way for the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie to realize its ambitions, which, as the experience of 2005 has shown, could not be realized in a direct confrontation with organized labor. In plain English, as the loss of tax revenues and an increase in government expenditure due to a planned bad bank would erode government's financial capacity, the neoliberal comprador bourgeoisie would have an argument for further cuts in social expenditures at hand, while the penniless state would not be able to play its role as the counterpart of the organized labor in the social dialogue, as it would have nothing more to offer anyway. As I said, the right-wing government was ousted from the office. Nevertheless, the times ahead for Slovenian working class are bleak. Firstly, the state is losing blood to financial markets that, together with the Commission, demand the structural reforms and cuts in spending. This burden will no doubt end on the shoulders of working class. Therefore, one can expect increased pressures on unions as social partners to deliver on working class acceptance of the concessions to capital in order to enhance the competitiveness of the national economy. Secondly, the national bourgeoisie that was in the past willing and able to strike compromises with the organized labor is suffering an ideological retreat after the fiasco with the ill-famed management buyout. Thirdly, and most importantly, although organized labor is still capable of mobilizing considerable support in the streets, there is an emerging divide eroding the working class unity that runs along the line, separating workers in the core from workers in the periphery of the labor market. It is a divide that the neoliberal bourgeoisie is eager to exploit. This divide already appeared at the outset of the transition process, when a large part of employment in the incorporated sector was lost while the new jobs were generated at the periphery of the labor market. It is estimated that today over 40% of labor force works in the precarious labor arrangements. This trend was compounded by changes in the structure of employment by size classes of companies. While during the years of transition, employment in large, strongly unionized companies declined, it was steadily growing in small businesses, in small business that is less accessible to trade unions. This means not only that collectives of workers are smaller and thus harder to organize. It also means that those on the flexibilized periphery of the labor market, who are in a constant state of flux, struggling to improve their employability, often working as self-employed in order to relieve their employers of costs and risks associated with regular employment contracts, are forced upon an entrepreneurial culture. It is precisely on this front that the decisive battle must be fought. For while these workers could, in accordance with their daily experience and practice, in fact assume an entrepreneurial attitude, their economic situation is that of the exploited working class. But as these flexible, precarious workers in small businesses and always in a state of flux cannot form a collective on the small shop floor level, the only way to organize them and foster solidarity is the sphere of the struggle itself. To organize them, however, the trade unions have to turn away from their role of responsible social partners and build their identity on the basis of class unionism as the only possible basis for an organization of workers in such different conditions and labor arrangement is a class-wide organization. Failure to build a solid class identity by effectively organizing the precarious workers would not only mean leaving them behind, it would also expose the core labor force to the onslaught of the capitalist state and the neoliberal bourgeoisie.
Thank you, Branko. Now it's time for the debate. Perhaps we'll start with the speakers themselves. Do you have any comments or critiques addressed to each other? So any question up there, please?
I would like to go back to the question with which Goran finished his talk, which is the question of the national bourgeoisie, or more precisely, does it have a future? So I would like to ask all the panelists, how do they assess the current strength or potential strength of the national bourgeoisie to formulate a different and alternative kind of political program? I would especially like to ask this question in context of, for instance, Viktor Orban or earlier Kaczynski's governments in Poland, etc. And also maybe some of the panelists have some ideas as to why does this national bourgeoisie in the so-called transition countries does not have so clear articulated positions compared, for instance, with Latin America or other
nations? We start with Hungary and Orban. I mean, what is interesting about, I would say, the Orban government or Fidesz government, I mean, it is featuring interests of the upper middle class and, let's say, smaller bourgeoisie, not in the core sectors. I mean, agriculture and commerce. That's not core sectors. And in trying to promote the interests of these sectors of domestic bourgeoisie, the Fidesz government is partially confronting certain sectors of foreign-owned business, mainly the banks and the big retail companies, for example. But it has never confronted the industrial side, industrial externally owned business. And it is continuing the former relationship, building on industrial FDI and building a low-wage sector, and systematically weakening labor. And so far, I would say this economic nationalism, it has a real side, but it is mainly in services. It is not in industry. With Poland, Kaczynski government, PiS as a party probably is a bit different from Hungary. Because something like a local industrial bourgeoisie, though not in a very strong position, at least does exist. And there is a more important state-owned sector in Poland than in Hungary. There is still, for example, a state-owned bank in Poland, an important one. And the relationship of PiS with the trade unions is different from Fidesz. Fidesz has not a relevant relationship to trade unions, but PiS does have to Solidarność to PiS. And this, for example, has tempered the desire of PiS to privatize, to continue privatization. It's a more, I would call it a more ambiguous relationship. And generally speaking, I would say that the domestic bourgeoisie, with the partial exception of Slovenia, is very weak in the industrial sector. And it is not existing in the financial sector. In Slovenia, there are still the state-owned banks, I think, which are important for the national bourgeoisie. And I would suspect that the continuation of state-owned banks in Slovenia would be crucial for a relevant role of that type of a more national type of bourgeoisie. Probably that is a certain area where there is a for possible coincidence of interest of left-wing forces with that section of the bourgeoisie, preserving the banks, but public banks, but redefining their role. I mean, there can be no doubt, from my point of view, there can be no doubt about that. And generally, the question is question of the development model. And in the Visegrad countries in Slovenia, manufacturing still plays a role. But except for Slovenia and partially Poland, industry is totally controlled by external capital and extremely dependent on the German export business. So far, I would say a left-wing strategy has to reduce external dependence, from my point of view. In the Baltic countries, Southeastern Europe, I mean, it is even much more complicated because the productive sectors have been so much weakened. And the currency policies have contributed to weakening the industrial basis because of the overvaluation of the currency. And both external capital and domestic capital is concentrated in services. Financial services and banking. And I mean, this financialized type of development, I think it is in a total cul-de-sac. And it's even much more difficult than in the Visegrad countries and Slovenia to find a way out of that, I would say, very profound development crisis.
Should we also answer? Yeah, I think I made myself pretty clear when presenting the Serbian case. The conclusion stemming from my analysis is that there is no such thing as Serbian national bourgeoisie at this point in time, and it would be really a waste of time looking for it for the reason that I explained. This is a myth which is kind of a complex, if you wish, of lower value, which always comes, you come across it in the discourse of Serbian nationalism over and over, and this is this complex that we cannot get along, right? And Srbi ne mogu da se slože. And then it is explained in mystical and historical frames and so on. But what stands behind it is really the character, the nature of the ruling class in Serbia, which indeed does not have any common endeavor which would unite it and which would kind of, spread the spoils, if you wish, and unite them over a common goal and organize them as a class. You have different fractions which is engaged in internal fightings, killings of politicians, assassinations, and so on, and dependent on different sources of foreign income and privatization perks coming from scavenging of the remains of former infrastructure. As for the rest of the Eastern European countries, I mean, Joachim explained much better. I'm not so well acquainted with the specific national cases, but I do tend to see a certain tendency, certain regularities of seeing Serbia maybe as a more extreme, more dense process, which can be to a certain extent applied to all transitional countries. Just one latest, because I think it's very important what he mentioned, and this should not be left untouched. And this is the case, the question of Latin America and the comparison. I think it is exactly the type of thing that came in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s with dependency theories, when the mainstream modernization theories were put into question and the nature of the regimes were put in question, and there was no such thing as a progressive bourgeoisie in Latin America which should support the type of positions, the conclusions and analysis that we should kind of try to emulate in Eastern Europe at the time. Now, the left forces in Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons why you see things that are different in Latin America is exactly because there is such a strong push from below, from the movement, from the streets, which then creates breaks into different channels within the ruling class or the middle classes or the army. Then you have different cases. You have Peronism in Argentina, where you will have a kind of a left-wing development, such as in Venezuela, you have a part of the army which kind of comes to the fore of this popular mass movement from below. So kind of this pressure from below is something which really account for in the perspectives also of Eastern Europe.
Okay, I will just ask for precision and briefness in questions and answers because we are running out of time.
I had two short questions for Goran. If I understood your argument, you were basically saying that there was a process of primitive accumulation occurring insofar as there are new relations of production emerging. And that, but you described it solely in terms of national issues without raising the question of external forces such as the IMF conditionality. And one interesting question would be if you could articulate the relationship between the international and the national in that respect. The second question was in relationship to, you say that this process of primitive accumulation was stopped, that the opposite of it ultimately occurred. And one of the questions, I don't know whether you want to go into this last, is when did it start?
Yeah, okay, just short answers. Of course, and I refer to it in a way, the international factor, the foreign factor, is a crucial one. However, I consciously decided to focus on the internal factors simply because these factors have been put to the fore many times before. And there are already researches and many things written on the role of the IMF, of the pressure of imperialism when it comes to Serbia, the role of foreign interest in breakup of Yugoslavia. You have plenty of things written on these themes. And it is exactly therefore that I try to really focus on things inside which allow these foreign factors to come in and then insert their interest. But as I said, I mean, this should be undoubtedly, this should be regarded in a close relationship. And it is very much a question, even if there was no specificity of black market, of internal fightings in Yugoslavia, of wars of secession, if the national bourgeoisie would ultimately form itself as a strong, self-confident bourgeoisie in relation to the foreign capital, or would it go down the same path as Slovenia national bourgeoisie is today? So this is an important thing. And the second question was, when did it start? When it comes to Yugoslavia, this is a very tricky question. And I always tend to go to the 1960s and the period called market socialism, which I used, and it is very strictly used to describe 1960s and reforms which took place then, not the 1980s. But I see many similarities in the late 1980s, of kind of even you can follow personal biographies of people who were kind of shut down in the late 60s, who re-emerge and then say we should not, make the same mistakes again. This time we should follow through the reforms till the end. And if you are a scholar of Yugoslav history, you know that in the 60s reform went pretty far. I mean, it went to the instances where there were de facto shareholding, attempts of shareholding in practice, and people going to jail because of it.
What I found very intriguing listening to your analysis of the heterogeneous developments taking place in the post-socialist transition, in which the shared view was we got to figure out what has been and still happening in the transitional configurations. What strikes me is that I see very little difference with non-transitional states. The story you were telling me, I could apply in the same heterogeneous way to Ireland, to the UK, to Spain, Portugal, the disappearance of a domestic industrial bourgeoisie, the restructuring of the bourgeoisie in terms of a strange articulation between a landed capitalist class, land, infrastructure, etc., in association with the transnational, cosmopolitan financial elite. And that is what structures the contemporary configuration, despite massive geographical differences. Now, if that is the case, if there has been indeed a profound transformation throughout Europe, the global north more generally, in terms of the capitalist class composition, that is the disappearance of an industrial bourgeoisie very much linked to a national industrial policy very often and a national labor movement, etc., to a new type of configuration that has no national affiliation anymore. Nowhere. I cannot speak any longer of a British national bourgeoisie. It does not exist. There is a very strong financial sector which is internationalized. Now, if that is the case, that if the present configuration of neoliberal capitalism is one of geographically variegated configurations of land financial elites, the question then is, what is the appropriate left political response to that in the disappearance of a kind of proletarian in the industrial sense of the word that would ally or not, as the case may be, with a national bourgeoisie in the configuration of a national modernizing project. That sounds extremely strange to me today, and not strange, it sounds dangerous to me in the context of transnational financial elites who have no geographical rootedness except ephemeral one. In London, the financial sector is run by Serbs, Slovenians, Belgians, French, American, Japanese, Middle Eastern financial capitalists.
Can you make it?
So the question is, what do we do with those matters?
Just because it's more or less a very similar question. I just wanted to report on the small occurrence. When I did a research on Otpor in Belgrade, I met the one who's financing it mostly, and was a guy called Goran Vinovic. So he's number 3, Vinovic. And he's number 3, he owns Orion, number 3 in the telecommunications. And he was all the time stating that this is a Serbian company. And I wondered what he's talking about. Focusing on, it is Serbian, so it's a national compared to Telecom, German, etc. And when I look at the Serbian market in telecommunications, I see it is an international market. And it's no use to strength or to focus on national. So is that the pure ideology? There's nothing to do with the actual capitalism because it's globalized. So in terms of left strategies, I ask myself, what does this term national bourgeois still lead to, still mean, still really, has it still any relevance? That was pure ideology, what was telling me about this importance of the national communication. So that's just a question in terms of strategy for the left to use this term for force.
First of all, I'm a bit skeptical about this global. I mean, in the case of Eastern Europe, the banking sector is mainly Austrian, Italian, and Belgian. Not even German and Greek, not to forget the Greeks. So, and I mean, the Austrian banking sector is extremely closely linked to ÖVP, to the Conservative Party. And in the crisis, of course, it had the support of the Austrian state. And the Austrian state and the government intervened, for example, in Ukraine, in order that with the mortgages is to be dealt in a way that is not too detrimental to Raiffeisen, for example. And I mean, it has become quite obvious that the national governments intervene on behalf of their national banking sectors. To some extent, for the bigger countries as well, for example, for favor of Volkswagen, etc., or of the French companies. A German sociologist, Hartmann, I mean, he made research on elites, and his empirical research, for example, shows that in many cases, the boards of directors have primarily a national outlook, not even a European one. And this, I would say, relativizes to a certain extent the question of Europeanization or globalization. And even in EU policies, it is obvious that certain national governments are more able to influence, in that case particularly German governments, to put it precisely, to influence EU policies. The East European countries, like the Mediterranean countries, are countries of dependent capitalism. And this means that there is a much larger reliance on the import of goods and capital, a larger role of external capital in the domestic economy. And with the last 30, 40 years, the role of foreign capital has increased. And in the case of Eastern Europe, it has at times, even in an international comparison, extreme degree of control. For example, compared with large parts of Latin America. And with that, for the domestic bourgeoisie, it is mainly the less interesting business that is left. And business that is not exposed to international competition. And therefore it is trade, tourism, real estate and construction. I mean, that is branches which are directly linked to the territory, and where the exchange rate does not play a role. And this partially explains the similarities between Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Politically, I think it is important to see that the crisis process has not been uniform in the periphery, and especially it has not been synchronic. East European countries were the first to be hit by the crisis. Southern Europe only about a year, 18 months later. Therefore, social protest movements are not uniform either, nor do they coincide in time. And this makes a concerted response in the EU to the crisis by progressive left-wing forces extremely difficult. And I think, therefore, a necessity to have something like a national strategy is important as well. I agree that it would be important to build trans-border alliances, no doubt about that. But it is very unlikely that something like that of a dramatic change happens at the European level because of the uneven mobilizations and very different socio-economic and socio-political conditions in the EU.
Then I would ask you, what would you advise? Sorry. I have to reply to reply. Then yes. It's in the form of a question. What would you then suggest to the Slovenian working class to side with the domestic bourgeoisie and support it in conquering in its
in Serbian of Serbian market and Croatian market, and transfer repatriate the profits from there to here in order to build domestic industrial base.
I'm actually, even for small countries, rather in favor of the domestic market.
This is small.
Even if it's relatively small, and I think that there are elements where there is a conflict between working class and the national bourgeoisie, and that is not to be tapered over. But on the other hand, I think there can be certain points where there is a convergence. And so far, I would say something like a differentiated approach, yeah? And I'm not in a position to advise the Slovenian working class, yeah?
Okay, I'll have just a few points in the question then. The first thing, I think the case of ex-Yugoslavia is very good to show actually that we should not be using the concept of primitive accumulation and capital restoration for the period of 90s and 2000. Why? I would go back to the previous debate that we had these few days, and that is what is the central point of Marx's chapter on the so-called primitive accumulation. In my opinion, that's what has been already stated here, is the creation of wage labor as a value-producing commodity. That is, for me, the central point of the notion of primitive accumulation. Now, here in our area, on the Balkans, it was painfully prolonged through the 19th and the 20th century due to various reasons, but basically we have been, up until basically the Second World War, we have been the Western agrarian periphery, basically exporting food for Western manufacturers. And only in Serbia is actually proletariat emerging as a class to be dominant class as opposed to the self-sufficient in producing farmers. But we also at the same time have two specific things that are here I think important. One is wage rate inequalities according to the sector and production sector and region, which sort of implies that there is a general rate of profit that allocates the surplus value and it determines the cost of reproducing that labor power. That's one thing. On the other hand, we have unemployment in some areas in backward regions of Yugoslavia. That's structural unemployment that results in the export of 1 million workers until the end of 70s. So basically, only in Serbia we get the connection, we get the thing that connects the primitive accumulation and the expanded capital reproduction, which is the creation of the proletariat. But then, again, we should not forget what has been mentioned, the role of the IMF and those foreign institutions, which in the 80s resulted in two circles of austerity measures that were meant to be dealing with the debt and that did not deal away with the debt. So I think that what has been going on throughout the 90s and later on was actually a result of the failure to deal away with the debt economy in which the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia fell into through trying to basically bad deals to import capital and to bad that sort of bad measures. So my question would actually here be, isn't it more accurate here to use another Marxist concept, the concept of imperialism, to actually explain the logic of indebting, i.e. enslaving the whole of our region, because it's not just from Slovenia to Serbia, it's also the Greece, which is in the same position right now. Basically, the whole of the Balkans is in the same position. And concerning the question of the left-wing strategy, isn't it then logical to look towards how we should be connecting throughout the Balkans, not connecting with our national bourgeoisies or attempts on creating national bourgeoisies, but actually connecting our movement throughout the Balkans around the question of fighting the debt economy.
I'll try to be brief. I agree completely. As the previous comment mentioned, the role of the IMF is crucial. That there's a continuity of imperialism, as you say. Let's put it very black and white in the region, and it continues ever since the first partisan troops gained control over a sovereign piece of territory. There was a role of diplomacy and imperialist pressures and how to deal with them. However, and they continue until today. However, we must also account for kind of qualitative changes which take place within the country in this process under these pressures. And for me, as I said, the breakup of Yugoslavia is one of these qualitative transformations which we should take into account at that moment. And then the position of imperialism changes in relation to that, in supporting different countries, in supporting different forces which come into being through this transformation. But I would just like to maybe just really quickly come back to the previous comment. You said you're skeptical to global. I know you're skeptical to the term global, but I am skeptical to this, I would say, fashionable understandings or theories about non-existence of national bourgeoisie in the world today. And also the complete disappearance of industrial sectors and industrial bourgeoisie in highly developed industrialist countries. If there is no such thing as a nation-state or a nation-state bourgeoisie and the interests which lay behind it, then how do we explain the bickerings within the European Union today and different relations of power between different countries? How do we explain the unequal positions of the Eastern European countries in relation to the Western European countries, even though they're formally members of the EU, but it's quite clear that they are kind of the retarded brother within this family who is tutored by the more powerful states. Yeah, this is just some of the things we need to be careful.
I think we should, of course, we should think in terms that, of course, that there is not the national state did not disappear, but it was transformed into a competition state, which simply, as Mr. Becker said, simply precludes it makes it very difficult to make some international working class solidarity, as the jobs, the welfare state, everything is connected to the success of the whole competition state.
Unit.
Yes, yes. And this binds workers to the capital, either to the national bourgeoisie or to the neoliberal bourgeoisie.
Of course it does, but it is, as has been pointed, it is an ideology which correlates very, very hardly with the reality on the ground. I mean, if you look at the telecommunication sector, the banking sector, or the industrial sector of any of these countries, it is very easy to break through this, the ideology of the national bourgeoisie and of competitive unit as a nation state. And this is exactly something that the left forces in the region should put forward, in my opinion. This is the main thing that we should be doing is exactly exposing the so-called national bourgeoisie as nothing else but the pawns of the more powerful capitalist classes in more advanced countries. And instead of trying to find the more progressive part of it and support it, we should really offer models of organization which exclude these elites, and
the national or both?
for the beginning within our frame of our nation states. Well, of course, we should connect this to the social movements taking place in Europe.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think at this moment I have to kind of debate and relegate the remaining questions and problems to the debate outside. Among other arguments, there is food waiting outside, so I would just like to invite you to the evening lecture, which is the lecture will be held by Bernard Bonaparte. It will be at 6 o'clock here, and yeah, come to us.